Welcome to our lecture on the social and cultural policies of the British in India before 1857. In this session, we are going to explore how the British administration grappled with the vast ancient culture of the Indian subcontinent. We will look at the fierce intellectual debates between different British factions, the various schools of thought that shaped colonial policy, and the cautious, often self-serving ways the British intervened in Indian social institutions and practices. Let us begin with a group known as the Orientalists. These were British scholars and administrators who possessed a profound knowledge of Asian languages and cultures. Figures like Warren Hastings and William Jones held a deep respect for India's ancient past. They believed that Indian civilization had reached incredible heights of glory in antiquity, even though they felt it had declined in recent times. To understand the people they were ruling, they felt an urgent need to bypass recent history and dig into ancient sacred and legal texts to uncover the original foundational laws of Hindus and Muslims. Because the Orientalists revered this ancient heritage, their approach to governance was quite unique for a colonial power. They firmly believed that British rule in India should be based on India's own ancient customs and traditions, not on imported European laws. To achieve this, they actively promoted Indian learning. They mastered local languages and translated massive volumes of Sanskrit and Persian texts. They also put their ideas into practice by establishing educational institutions. Warren Hastings set up the Calcutta Madrasa in 1781 to cultivate the study of Muslim law, and a decade later, Jonathan Duncan established the Sanskrit College at Varanasi to preserve and study Hindu philosophy. One of the most prominent Orientalists was Henry Thomas Colebrook. He is widely recognized as the first great Sanskrit scholar in Europe. Arriving in India in 1782 as a writer for the East India Company, he quickly rose through administrative and legal ranks while mastering Sanskrit. His expertise was so highly regarded that in 1805, Lord Wellesley made him an honorary professor at the College of Fort William. Colebrook's contributions to legal scholarship were immense. He translated complex treatises into English, such as his Digest of Hindu Law and Law of Inheritance, which became essential tools for British judges trying to apply Hindu law in colonial courts. Another fascinating figure is Nathaniel Halhed, a pioneering grammarian and close friend of Warren Hastings. Halhed actually wrote the first Bengali grammar book that utilized authentic Bengali script for its illustrations. But his most famous contribution came at Hastings' direct request. Hastings wanted a definitive legal code to help govern the Hindu population. So 11 Brahmin pundits compiled a digest of Hindu laws in Sanskrit. This was then translated into Persian, and Halhed translated that Persian version into English, publishing it in 1776 as a Code of Gentoo Laws. This multi-step translation process highlights how heavily the British relied on local intermediaries. To institutionalize this passion for Eastern knowledge, Sir William Jones, a Supreme Court judge, founded the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784. The society became the intellectual hub for Oriental studies. Its primary mission was to rescue old Indian manuscripts from obscurity and translate them for a global audience. They published their findings in a journal called Asiatic Researches. Through the society, foundational texts of Indian culture were introduced to the English-speaking world. Jones himself translated the Manusmriti and the famous play Abhigyana Shakuntalam, while Charles Wilkins produced the first English translation of the Bhagavad Gita. Seriously, but not everyone in the British administration shared this romantic view of India's past. Enter the Anglicists, led by influential figures like James Mill and Thomas Macaulay. They fiercely attacked the Orientalists. To the Anglicists, Eastern knowledge was not a glorious heritage to be preserved, but rather a collection of unscientific thoughts and errors. They argued that if the British were going to educate Indians, they shouldn't waste time on ancient poetry and sacred texts. Instead, they insisted that Indians must be taught the scientific, technical, and rational advancements of the modern West. One of the most vocal Anglicists was James Mill, a Scottish historian and philosopher who actually never visited India. In 1817, he published a massive work called A History of British India. In this book, he famously divided Indian history into 3 distinct periods: the Hindu period, the Muslim period, and the British period. This periodization was deeply flawed. By categorizing entire eras solely by the religion of the ruling elite, Mill completely ignored the rich, pluralistic reality of India, where multiple faiths and cultures coexisted and interacted simultaneously throughout history.
Mill viewed India through a strictly Eurocentric lens. He genuinely believed that all Asian societies were inherently inferior to Europe. In his narrative, India before the British arrived was a dark age, suffering under the yoke of despots and paralyzed by superstition, caste taboos, and religious intolerance. Consequently, Mill saw British rule not as an occupation, but as a progressive, civilizing mission. He even advocated for the total conquest of all Indian territories, arguing that the Indian people were incapable of progress on their own and desperately needed British laws and manners to achieve enlightenment and happiness. This Anglicist disdain reached its peak with Thomas Macaulay, who became the first law member of the Governor-General's Council in 1834. Macaulay was unapologetic in his belief that India was uncivilized. He famously and arrogantly declared that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the entire native literature of India and Arabia. He strongly urged the British government to completely defund Oriental learning, which he deemed practically useless. Instead, Macaulay championed the English language, arguing it was the only key that could unlock the doors of Western science, philosophy, and rational thought for the Indian population.
Now, looking back at the Orientalists, it is easy to view them purely as romantic scholars, but we must understand their practical pragmatism. Warren Hastings didn't promote Indian learning just out of intellectual curiosity. It was a highly calculated political strategy. The British were a tiny minority trying to govern a vast, complex society. By teaching British officials the local languages, customs, and legal codes, they could administer justice more effectively, build crucial alliances with local elites, and ultimately secure and stabilize their rule over India. Knowledge, for the Orientalists, was a tool of empire. These debates between Orientalists and Anglicists fed into broader philosophies about how to govern the colony. Broadly speaking, the British officials who determined Indian policy fell into three distinct schools of thought. First, the conservative or traditional attitude, which favored caution. Second, the imperialistic attitude, which was highly critical and dominant. And third, the radical attitude, which pushed for aggressive modernization based on European ideals. Let's break down each of these perspectives.
The conservative school, represented by early administrators like Warren Hastings and later figures like Thomas Munro and Mount Stuart Elphinstone, held a genuine respect for Indian culture. They acknowledged that while Indian civilization was different from Europe's, it wasn't necessarily inferior. Their main concern was stability. They strongly opposed rapid modernization, fearing it would provoke a violent backlash from the Indian population. However, this respect came with a heavy dose of paternalism. They viewed Indians essentially as children who needed British guidance, which conveniently justified keeping Indians completely out of higher administrative roles. By the year 1800, the cautious conservative approach was rapidly being replaced by a harsh imperialistic attitude. This school of thought was sharply critical of everything Indian. Imperialists argued that Indian society was entirely static and incapable of growth. They labeled local customs as uncivilized, institutions as corrupt, and traditional thought as narrow and unscientific. This wasn't just academic criticism, it was a deliberate ideological weapon. By painting India as a backward, decadent society, British officials and writers could morally justify the political conquest and economic exploitation of the subcontinent. In the 1820s, a third group emerged, the Radicals. Influenced by the European Enlightenment, figures like Jeremy Bentham and the Mills applied Western rationalism to India. They were driven by the doctrines of reason, humanism, and progress. They genuinely believed they could improve the lives of Indians through complete and rapid modernization, introducing Western science and literature. But there was a glaring paradox in their philosophy. While these radicals fought passionately for democratic government back home in Britain, they demanded a strict authoritarian regime in India. Like the conservatives, they believed Indians were not ready to govern themselves. These shifting ideologies directly impacted how the British interacted with Indian society. Before 1813, following Warren Hastings' lead, the British maintained a strict policy of non-interference in India's religious and social life. They just wanted to collect revenue and maintain order. But after 1813, we see a dramatic pivot. The colonial state began taking active steps to intervene and transform Indian culture. This shift wasn't random. It was driven by a convergence of several powerful forces: the Industrial Revolution in Britain, the rise of radical thought, the pressure from Christian missionaries, and the demands of Indian social reformers themselves. Let's look at the economic driver first, industrialization. British factories were mass-producing goods and desperately needed new markets. Simply keeping the peace in India wasn't enough anymore. British capitalists realized that to sell their products, they needed to change the very tastes and desires of the Indian people. They believed that westernizing Indian society would automatically create a massive demand for British goods. This economic push culminated in the Charter Act of 1813, which ended the East India Company's monopoly and flooded India with British merchants, perfectly aligning with the radicals' push for westernization. Alongside the merchants came the Christian missionaries. They supported westernization, but for religious reasons. They hoped that teaching Western science and literature would destroy the locals' faith in Hinduism and Islam, paving the way for mass conversion to Christianity. To this end, they opened schools and hospitals. Interestingly, they allied with British merchants, arguing that a Christian convert would be a better consumer of British goods. At the same time, brilliant Indian social reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy were also pushing for change from within. They recognized the stagnation in their own society and actively campaigned for modernization, using science and humanism to revive India. Despite all these pressures to modernize, the British government adopted a policy of only partial modernization. Why? First, many officials were still deeply conservative. Second, there was an intense fear of backlash. They knew that aggressively interfering with deeply held religious customs could spark a massive violent revolution. But the most important reason was colonial self-interest. The British realized a dilemma. They needed some modernization to make India a profitable market, but if they fully modernized and educated the population, the Indians would eventually overthrow them. So they carefully introduced reforms that boosted profits while actively blocking any progress that threatened their supremacy. This delicate balancing act completely fell apart after the Great Revolt of 1857. Post-1858, the British essentially abandoned their modernization project. As Indians began to embrace modern education, they started demanding the very things the British cherished at home: liberty, equality, and national sovereignty. Terrified by this political awakening, the British abruptly changed sides. They withdrew their support from Indian reformers and formed alliances with the most orthodox, conservative elements of society. To maintain control, they actively encouraged casteism and communalism to keep the population divided. From then on, the fight for social reform was carried almost entirely by enlightened Indians. Before that retreat, however, the British did enact several humanitarian measures against extreme social practices. One major target was female infanticide, the tragic practice of killing female infants at birth, which was prevalent among certain Rajput clans due to the crushing financial burden of dowries. Jonathan Duncan took early initiative in 1789, meeting with local leaders and using Hindu scriptures to convince them the practice was a sin, securing written agreements to stop it. Missionaries like William Carey also campaigned heavily. This led to early regulations banning the practice in 1795, 1802, and 1804. However, passing a regulation and enforcing it are two different things. These early bans were largely ignored until the tenures of Governor-Generals William Bentinck and later Henry Hardinge, who sternly enforced them. Hardinge, by the way, also took action to suppress human sacrifices among the Gond tribe. Because infanticide persisted in secret, the government, pressured by reformers, eventually passed the Female Infanticide Prevention Act of 1870. While it was effective in Bengal, the practice tragically continued in other regions. It is crucial to note that the drive to end this came from local officials on the ground and missionaries, not from the authorities back in London. Another major intervention was the abolition of sati, the practice of a widow burning herself on her husband's funeral pyre. The intellectual groundwork for banning it was laid in 1795, when Orientalist H.T. Colebrook proved that sati was not actually mandated by authentic Vedic traditions. Initially, the government just tried to regulate it, ruling in 1813 that a widow had to be at least 16, but the real momentum came from Indian reformers. Raja Ram Mohan Roy launched a fierce campaign against sati, using his journal Samwad Kaumudi to shape public opinion, and publicly debating Orthodox scholars to prove the practice had no religious sanction. Thanks to the relentless pressure from Ram Mohan Roy, other enlightened Indians, and missionaries, Governor-General William Bentinck finally outlawed sati in 1829 through the Bengal Sati Regulation. It's worth noting that earlier Indian rulers, including Akbar and the Peshwas, had also tried to discourage this practice. Unfortunately, the shadow of this custom lingered long into the modern era, As recently as 1987, the tragic case of Roop Kanwar, a young Rajput woman forced into sati in Rajasthan, sparked massive national outrage. This led the modern Indian government to pass the strict Commission of Sati Prevention Act of 1987 to punish both the act and its glorification.
The British also addressed slavery, which existed in various forms across India. In port cities like Bombay and Calcutta, it involved the active trading of enslaved people from Africa and Arabia, while in Madras it was primarily agricultural, or predial slavery. Although Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807 and outlawed slavery across its empire in 1833, the East India Company dragged its feet in India, claiming the practice had religious sanction. It wasn't until 1843 that Act 5 officially abolished slavery in India. However, the legal ban had limited immediate impact. Slavery truly declined only later in the century, when massive public works and plantations created alternative sources of wage labor.
Finally, we look at the plight of Hindu widows, who, even if saved from sati, faced a life of severe social ostracization and were strictly forbidden from remarrying. The champion for this cause was Pandit Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. Much like Ram Mohan Roy did with sati, Vidyasagar meticulously researched ancient texts to prove that widow remarriage was actually permitted in Hindu scripture. After a long and bitter struggle against orthodox elements, his efforts bore fruit when the government passed the Hindu Widows Remarriage Act in 1856, legally enabling widows to start their lives anew.
When we assess these British social policies as a whole, the reality is quite sobering. Their attempts at reform achieved minimal success. Paralyzed by the fear of sparking a revolt, the colonial state's interventions were hesitant and barely scratched the surface of the vast Indian social system. For the vast majority of the population, these laws had negligible immediate impact. Furthermore, the true heroes of this era were not the British Parliament, but the Western-educated Indian intelligentsia, local missionaries, and a few dedicated administrators who forced the government's hand. Next, we will explore how these very debates over modernization and culture directly shaped the spread of English education across the subcontinent.
Before the British established their territorial power, India had a robust, locally funded indigenous education system. For the Muslim community, education was imparted in madrasas and maktabs, while Hindus attended tolls and pathshalas. These schools were supported by wealthy individuals rather than the state, and they heavily emphasized classical languages like Sanskrit, Arabic, and Persian. Unfortunately, formal education was largely inaccessible to women during this period.
In the 1830s, a Scottish missionary named William Adam was appointed to survey vernacular schools. He found over 100,000 small pathshalas in Bengal and Bihar. What stood out was the system's incredible flexibility. There were no fixed fees, no printed books, and no rigid timetables. Classes were even suspended during harvest, so children from peasant families could work in the fields. Adam actually proposed reviving the system using vernacular languages, but Lord Bentinck rejected the idea.
Initially, the British East India Company maintained a policy of strict non-intervention in Indian culture. However, there were a few notable exceptions, driven by administrative needs. In 1781, Warren Hastings established the Calcutta Madrasa to train Indians in Muslim law. 10 years later, Jonathan Duncan founded the Sanskrit College in Varanasi for Hindu philosophy and laws. Later, in 1800, Lord Wellesley set up the College of Fort William, specifically to educate young British civil service recruits.
Pressure from missionaries and enlightened Indians eventually forced the company to abandon its neutrality. The Charter Act of 1813 marked the real beginning of Western education in India. It officially permitted Christian missionaries to enter India for educational activities and, crucially, mandated an annual budget of 1 lakh rupees for education. Though this money largely went unspent at first, it was the first time the British state acknowledged responsibility for educating Indians.
The 1813 Act did not specify how the money should be spent, sparking the Anglo-Oriental controversy. Orientalists argued for the promotion of traditional Sanskrit and Arabic literature, alongside Western sciences. Conversely, Anglicists pushed for teaching Western knowledge exclusively through the English language. Interestingly, progressive Indians like Raja Ram Mohan Roy strongly supported the Anglicist view, believing that studying modern Western sciences was essential for India's progress. Seriously, the debate was finally settled by Lord Macaulay's Minute in 1835. Macaulay was highly dismissive of Indian culture, famously claiming Oriental literature lacked practical value. He strongly advocated for Western science and literature taught in English. His underlying motive was clear. He wanted to create a class of interpreters who were Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, morals, and intellect, thereby serving British commercial and administrative interests.
Following Macaulay's Minute, the government acted swiftly. By 1837, English replaced Persian as the official language, and by 1844, it became a prerequisite for government jobs. Because funds were limited, the British adopted the downward filtration theory. The idea was to educate a small elite class, hoping they would filter this knowledge down to the masses. In reality, this failed entirely. The educated elite secured government jobs and formed a separate class, leaving mass education completely neglected.
While the government focused on the elite, missionaries and private individuals stepped in. In Bengal, David Hare helped establish the Hindu College, India's first Western-style secular college. J.E.D. Bethune made strides in women's education by founding a girls' school in Calcutta. Similar efforts took root in other presidencies, with the Bombay Native Education Society and the Madras Christian College laying the early groundwork for modern education across the provinces.
Mount Stuart Elphinstone, the governor of Bombay, was a pivotal figure. At a time when many in Britain opposed educating Indians, he actively raised funds to teach English and European sciences, leading to the creation of the Bombay Native Education Society. Beyond education, he was the first Bombay governor to codify civil and criminal laws to make the justice system fairer, and he introduced the Ryotwari land revenue system. Elphinstone College was later established in his honor.
In 1854 came a turning point, Wood's Educational Dispatch, often called the Magna Carta of English education in India. Issued by Charles Wood, it officially rejected the downward filtration theory, stating the government must take direct responsibility for educating the masses. It recommended setting up universities in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, creating provincial departments of education, and introducing a grants and aid system to support private schools.
While Wood's dispatch sounded progressive, its motives were deeply self-serving. Economically, the British hoped European learning would change Indian tastes, creating a massive new market for British manufactured goods. Administratively, they needed a cheap, reliable supply of educated Indians to fill lower-level government jobs, saving the cost of importing British clerks. Politically, they believed an English education would make Indians more loyal and reconciled to British rule. To review the progress made since Wood's dispatch, the Hunter Commission was appointed in 1882. It focused heavily on primary and secondary education. For primary schools, it recommended using vernacular languages and shifting control to local district and municipal boards. For secondary education, it suggested a two-tier system: literary courses for university preparation and vocational courses for commercial careers, while heavily encouraging private enterprises to take the lead. Moving into the 20th century, Lord Curzon appointed the Raleigh Commission, leading to the Indian Universities Act of 1904. This act expanded university functions, allowing them to appoint professors and conduct research, backed by a new annual grant. However, Indians strongly opposed it. They saw the increased government control over university senates as a deliberate attempt to suppress indigenous institutions and curb the rising political unrest following the partition of Bengal. Around this time, the demand for mass education grew. In 1906, the princely state of Baroda boldly introduced compulsory primary education. Inspired by this, G.K. Gokhale pushed a similar bill in the Imperial Legislative Council in 1911, but it was defeated. The British government formally refused to make education compulsory in 1913. However, persistence paid off locally when Vittalbhai Patel successfully passed the Bombay Primary Education Act in 1918. In 1917, the Sadler Commission was formed to look into the workings of Calcutta University, but its recommendations shaped education nationwide. It proposed a structured system, a 12-year school course followed by intermediate colleges, and then a 3-year university degree. It also advocated for less government interference in academics, better student welfare, and the creation of special boards to promote women's education. With the Government of India Act of 1919, the diarchy system transferred the education department to Indian ministers. This sparked a wave of educational expansion, though severe financial limits remained. By 1929, the Hartog Committee actually recommended slowing down to consolidate quality over quantity. Finally, the 1944 Sargent Plan laid out a post-war vision to universalize primary education and elevate Indian education to the standards of industrialized nations. Looking back, the British education policy had severe drawbacks.
Mass education was chronically underfunded and hindered by the English language barrier. This created a massive cultural gulf between the educated elite and the common people. Traditional Indian education withered without state support. Women's education was largely ignored because women could not be employed as government clerks. Furthermore, the system had a heavy literary bias, producing graduates with almost no scientific or technical skills. Despite its flaws and colonial motives, the introduction of modern education had unintended positive consequences. It broadened intellectual horizons and, combined with the printing press, made knowledge widely accessible. Exposure to Western philosophers sparked a new spirit of rationalism, leading young Indians to question oppressive traditional values. Ultimately, educated Indians weaponized this very knowledge to spread ideas of democracy, social justice, and anti-imperialism, fueling the national movement. Christian missionaries played a complex role. They championed English education, hoping it would lead Indians to adopt Christianity. Facing early bans from the East India Company, William Carey set up the famous Serampore mission in Danish territory in 1800. Carey was a linguistic pioneer. He set up a printing press, wrote grammars for multiple Indian languages, translated classical texts, and actively campaigned against social evils like infanticide. Because the colonial government neglected female education, Indian reformers took the lead. In 1848, Jyotiba Phule, Savitriba Phule, and Fatima Sheikh made history by opening India's first school for girls in Pune. The following year, J.E.D. Bethune founded the Calcutta Female School, supported by Ishwar Chandra Vidyasakar. This institution eventually became Bethune College, which produced the subcontinent's first female graduates, Kadambini Ganguly and Chandramukhi Basu, in 1883. Women reformers were also formidable forces for change. Begum Sultan Jahan of Bhopal established numerous girls' schools and funded major colleges across India. Similarly, Begum Rokeya Sakawat Hussain was a fierce critic of conservative patriarchy. She opened schools for Muslim girls and wrote groundbreaking literature, including Sultana's Dream, an early feminist science fiction story. In 1916, she founded the Muslim Women's Association to fight for education and employment rights. Indian leaders developed their own distinct visions for education. Maharaja Sayajirao Gaikwad III of Baroda led the way by becoming the first Indian ruler to implement free and compulsory primary education in 1906. Meanwhile, Mahatma Gandhi fiercely criticized Western education, arguing it stripped Indians of their dignity. He proposed the Warda scheme, or Nai Talim, which focused on teaching through the mother tongue and integrating manual crafts to develop both the mind and soul. Other visionaries offered complementary ideas. Rabindranath Tagore believed rigid classrooms killed creativity. He founded Santiniketan to allow children to learn harmoniously with nature, blending Indian traditions with modern science. Aurobindo Ghosh emphasized national pride and vocational skills through the Bengal National College. Later, Dr. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, who chaired the first post-independence education commission, stressed that true education must go beyond facts to nurture wisdom, truth, and the human spirit. To counter the colonial narrative, Indians built their own institutions. In 1884, leaders like Lokmanya Tilak founded the Deccan Education Society in Pune to provide affordable, nationalist education, eventually establishing Ferguson College. On the scientific front, the Indian Agricultural Research Institute was established in 1905 in Pusa, Bihar, under Lord Curzon, laying the early groundwork for agricultural science in the subcontinent. To wrap up, the British educational policy in India evolved from non-intervention to calculated control, driven by administrative and economic motives. Landmarks like Macaulay's Minute and Wood's Dispatch cemented English as the medium of power, devastating indigenous systems and neglecting the masses. Yet this very system inadvertently armed Indian intellectuals with the modern ideas of democracy and rationalism needed to challenge social dogmas and ultimately dismantle the British Empire itself.